So Mr. Janson-Smith is the Chief Program Development and Innovation Officer at Verra. So he will be talking about the net zero through carbon dioxide removal, demand, supply, and the role of the voluntary carbon market. And let's welcome him.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for organizing this event. Great opportunity to talk to you all. So yes, my name is Toby Janson-Smith. I lead program development and innovation at Verra, which is the main standard setter for carbon credits and sustainable development standards in the climate space. I've been working in this space for about 25 years, primarily on standards and carbon markets, with an emphasis on nature-based solutions. So yeah, it's great to be talking to you all. So I wanted to just give a few remarks. I was asked to speak a little bit about carbon markets and how they work, and some different related aspects to those opportunities. So first off, as many of you know, as you engage with the COP, and other UN processes, obviously to tackle climate change, we need a lot of top-down regulation from governments, both at the global level and at the national and subnational levels. Carbon markets can play a really key role in supporting those compliance regimes and regulations, as well as offering complementary solutions through the voluntary carbon market. And I will talk a little bit about that. So if we think about, for example, regulations, one big area of market activity is emissions trading schemes. So whether that's the European Union across a trading bloc, or whether that's individual countries, like we might see in Colombia or South Africa or Chile, or California. An increasing number of governments are setting up emissions trading schemes as a flexible mechanism for companies and other industrial actors to be able to tackle their emissions through market mechanisms rather than through top-down or in complement to top-down regulation. Obviously, regulation is critical to cap certain sectors and to drive emissions down through different energy and industrial and transportation and other sectors' emissions. But at the same time, there are many sources of emissions that cannot be effectively regulated or controlled through those top-down systems. And that's where market mechanisms can become really critical and helpful. And the way that those work is, for example, if you have an emissions trading scheme, a government, national, subnational, might say that there's a target that each company or emitting entity has to reach in terms of their emissions. And they can do that through a combination of reducing their own emissions and then supplement that with a portion of emission reductions that could be achieved off-site through an external project, what we might call an offset project. And usually those are limited, so the primary action needs to be the company itself to reduce its emissions through its own activities, whether that's through its energy use, its processes, or indeed through its value chain, so its scope 3 emissions. So that's job one, and that will get us globally, according to the science-based targets, to about 80+% of the necessary mitigation that companies need to drive. But then there's the other 20% that is very hard for companies to squeeze out if they're trying to get all the way to net zero or carbon neutrality. And that's where carbon projects have a key role to play. The great thing about carbon projects and market mechanisms is that they can drive finance to the most efficient means to generate emission reductions and removals. So you can really focus on the activities that can deliver the greatest value for the least cost, rather than just being limited to what a company can do within its own value chain and emissions boundary. Also, it can start to create innovation and progress in new sectors that over time can be regulated. So it's a way for emerging sectors or activities or technologies to be tested out and proven through these projects, these offset and carbon credit projects, before governments, for example, might require their use or regulate around a particular sector. So it can be a critical on-ramp for regulation. And then finally, carbon markets and carbon credit projects can also bring finance to activities and sectors that otherwise would have a really hard time securing support to be implemented at scale. And a really good example of that is nature-based solutions, where, for example, the world's forests and say tropical deforestation, we're still losing about 10 million hectares per year. That's not going away or particularly going down. So there aren't incentives and finance to reduce deforestation. However, carbon finance and carbon market finance can provide much needed funding to incentivize the conservation of those forests and other ecosystems, whether they be wetlands, mangroves, even diverse agricultural ecosystems. And so that can be a key role that carbon markets can play, is drive finance to those sectors that otherwise would have a hard time driving emission reductions and removals. And also, as I mentioned, it can carbon finance can drive or support novel technologies, things like direct air capture or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or some of the other industrial processes that don't make economic sense unless there's a market incentive. So those are the reasons or some of the values around carbon markets. I wanted to say a few other things in terms of that folks should be aware of. One is the difference between nature-based solutions and technology and industrial solutions. There's been a lot of emphasis lately, of course, on the tech carbon dioxide removal or CDR activities. Like I mentioned, direct air capture is something that gets a lot of attention, or even carbon capture and storage more generally. And those are certainly important activities in terms of investing in, improving the technology and driving down the costs so they can be scaled. But at the same time, it's really critical that we don't lose sight of the low-hanging fruit, the cost-effective opportunities available through nature. And that includes forests, it includes agricultural ecosystems, includes oceans and wetlands. So these ecosystems have been, of course, sequestering and storing carbon for millennia and do that very effectively and cost effectively. And many of those ecosystems are being compromised, and carbon finance is one of the only ways we'll slow down that loss and the associated emissions in a meaningful way. And then similarly, on the restoration side is a critical opportunity for carbon finance to, for example, drive forest restoration, mangrove restoration, peatland rewetting and restoration, and regenerative agriculture. And those areas, of course, have tremendous potential to draw down atmospheric carbon from the atmosphere, as well as starting to restore ecosystems that we've lost or compromised. So those are tremendous opportunities, not just from the carbon dioxide reduction and removal side, but also in terms of driving social and environmental benefit. So whether you're conserving tropical forests that provide livelihoods for indigenous peoples and local communities, water benefits, biodiversity, conservation, these are tremendous values that can be unlocked with the right kinds of projects through these carbon market mechanisms. So that's one message I just want to leave you with. Let's make sure that we prioritize nature-based solutions while we're also investing in the technology side that will take a long time or much longer time to scale up, given the cost curve of some of those other activities. And the second related point is it's important not just to focus on carbon dioxide removals, but to also focus on reductions. So if you think about a bathtub analogy, you could be filling up, and the water in the tub is the atmosphere, or the tub is the atmosphere. You could be filling up the tub by emissions going into it, and you can bail those out with a bucket. So removing the emissions or removing the water from the tub, and that's important. But if you don't turn off the faucet, the spigot, the tap at the top, you continue to get emissions going into the bathtub or into the atmosphere. And that is obviously a losing proposition. So it's really critical we also focus on emission reductions and not just removals, especially in the next decade. And that is things like nature conservation, energy efficiency, renewables, and some of the other solutions that can reduce emissions as we work on the removal side of the equation. So those are a little bit, I think, some of the high-level remarks I wanted to to share. I think you have a few questions that I'd be happy to answer as well. Oh, and sorry, actually, I should just mention the voluntary carbon market. I was remiss. I was talking generally. So certainly carbon markets have a key role to play in compliance systems like emissions trading schemes, but they also are underpin voluntary corporate action. And most of the corporate leaders, for example, that have signed up for net zero commitments to basically, neutralize their overall emissions, do that through a combination of internal reductions through things like renewable energy, reduced transportation, industrial process emissions, and working on their value chains to reduce emissions there. And at best, they can get to 70, 80+% of their net zero goals through those activities. And they have to supplement the rest with these offsite or offset projects that can be nature-based, direct air capture, and things like that. And when you add that together, the companies can get to net zero and neutralize their overall impact, as well as generating these other social and environmental and technological advancement benefits that I mentioned. So that's kind of how the voluntary carbon market fits into this.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Toby. Thank you so much for your wonderful sharing. Is there any questions from the audience? Yeah, so,
Well,
yeah.
Toby, as far as the size of the voluntary market goes, what do you think it is now, and what do you think it'll be in 2 or 4 years?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, now it's just several $billion per year, so it's not that big. A lot of the analysis from JP Morgan, Trove, and others has indicated that really to tackle climate change properly, it's going to have to 10x or 20x in the next decade plus. In the next 5 years, to your question, my sense is next year will be relatively flat. I think a lot of the corporates are figuring out how all these pieces fit together. There's a lot of work on methodologies in carbon accounting that, for example, we're doing at Verra. And as some of you know, there's been criticisms of different projects in the voluntary space. And that's required, basically a whole set of new methodologies and accounting approaches that are using a lot of satellite data and AI and other algorithms. So those are just coming online actually at the end of this year. Some were released already. And so I think that, Peter, will start to unlock more or build more confidence back in the market and unlock activities that have been held up in the last year. So I think that'll take probably a year. And then I think we'll start to see a good steady rise and growth back in the market.
Great. Well, maybe I can ask one other question, which has always interested me. How do corporations justify spending, $100 million or $1 billion? How do they justify that to their shareholders?
In sort of carbon projects or their corporate climate
in the voluntary market, because they have obligation to return to their shareholders. How do they justify that?
Yeah, it's a great question. What's the value proposition, the demand case? I think with most major corporates, certainly in the global north, where there's an expectation from their various stakeholders that they take climate action or take responsibility. I think the pressure and the motivation comes from different sides. So one could be customers for a given company. So even if a given company is not particularly motivated to be climate leaders, it might be that their customers will say, we won't buy from you, or we won't source or be a customer of yours unless you do that, because we want to support an ecosystem. Or indeed, our scope 3 emissions are reliant on that. So Walmart is an example, a big retailer, global retailer, and they have very strict carbon accounting requirements of all their suppliers. And they have a scorecard, and they use that to determine, again, if they have two suppliers that can offer a product at a similar price, they will choose the supplier that has a lower carbon footprint or a lower environmental footprint. Mm-hmm. So that can be one incentive. Another incentive can be risk. So of course, in many cases, there's risk in value chains, supply chains. So many companies, if they have a land-based footprint, like they're an agricultural producer, they will try and address climate change through their value chains because that brings more resilience to their commodity supply, so it becomes existential for their business, raw materials, etc. And then finally, employees, of course, can be a huge driver of this. I think, this group here that has been pulled together and others, the newer generations, of course, generally are much more aware of the climate crisis and have much higher expectations of companies and everyone they deal with to take leadership in that area. So if you're a company like, let's say, a big tech company in the US or Europe, and you're trying to hire people, or that a student has or a young professional has multiple job offers, it can make a big difference that they go with the company that actually is seen as a climate leader and taking voluntary action. So that's a long-winded way of saying there are a lot of motivations why companies are taking leadership. And then if we're honest, at the end of the day, they would rather take voluntary leadership than be regulated, right? So that's another piece of the equation to sort of show that they're doing everything they can versus them just being told what to do. A great question, Peter.
Great answer. Thank you. Very useful.
Thanks. And I know there were a couple of questions in my prompt. Shall I answer those? One about the US election and one advice to any newcomers or students. So quickly on the US election, as was said earlier, I think in terms of global climate cooperation, of course, it's not great to have the current, Trump, for example, and his administration in office and his rhetoric around global climate collaboration, is not obviously helpful and can undermine some of those processes. I am cautiously optimistic that the rest of the world will move forward and sometimes with increased vigor in that regard. So we'll see how that actually plays out in terms of overall impact. I will say on the voluntary side, what we saw with the first Trump administration was that actually companies took more climate action. What happened was there was a recognition that the US government was not going to appropriately regulate climate change or emissions, and that it was going to come down to these companies and other actors to take leadership. So we actually saw an uptick in voluntary action, and we hope to see the same now, but we'll see how that plays out. And the second question, or the last question, was around advice to newcomers and students interested in pursuing a career in this space. So I would say, first, a few things. First and foremost, get your hands dirty, get out there, find work where you can actually do things, hands-on, whether it's in the field, whether it's working with scientists, whether it's building projects. But that kind of hands-on work is invaluable to see the realities, especially in the global south, of how you get things done in terms of climate action. And I think it's also an element that it's not going to be made redundant with artificial intelligence and new technologies. So it's less of a desk job and more of a hands-on proposition. So I think it's very rich and gives a lot of experience and learnings. I think, think about the role of AI and technology in the sectors you're looking into. To be aware that some of these new technologies could be very disruptive in good or challenging ways. So they could make some of the employment prospects more dim, or they could create amplification opportunities. I think finally, as young professionals, take risks. There's a great book by Tony Fadell called Built, who he wrote. He created the iPod and the iPhone and the Nest thermostat. So a brilliant innovator in the tech space, and he has a great chapter on young professionals or early career. And his biggest advices, which I totally agree with and share with my young young 20-year-old kids, is take risks, challenge yourself, try new things, don't be afraid of changing jobs and roles. Just get experience. As a young professional, you can take a lot of risks more easily than as you get older. And it's a great way to learn and grow and push yourself and find out what's out there, how you relate to those things, what you're good at, what you like to do. And then finally, if other people are interested, there's a great book I like by Cal Newport called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And that's a great book that for young professionals that really talks about, it's not so much about finding your passion. I think probably everyone on this line is passionate about climate change, but it's about how do you get really good at one area or one thing or one domain. And that unlocks all sorts of then opportunities and ability to make a difference. And then from that comes fulfillment and satisfaction. And so, yeah, So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport, I think, is a great orientating principle. It's not about just trying to figure out an abstract passion. It's about actually getting your hands dirty, trying things, and becoming really good at what you do through experience. And that unlocks meaning, passion, and purpose in one's life and career. So anyways, those are just a few high-level remarks on those two questions.
Fabulous. Yeah, many thanks for the book recommendation. Definitely on my to-do list. And so next we'll move on to the next panelist, and Anna will introduce.
Excuse me, can you please repeat once again the book name?
So
The
it's
book is
So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport.
Yeah, So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. And the other one is Tony Fadell, Build. That just has one chapter on young professionals, and the takeaway is take risks, push yourself. Don't be timid in your 20s. That's the time to try new things. Thank you.